"You'll get nothing," my husband laughed, slamming the thick stack of divorce papers onto the kitchen island. His eyes gleamed with a cruel, arrogant triumph as he leaned in close. "I built the company, I control the accounts, and I'm going to make sure you walk out of this marriage with absolutely zero. You're just a dependent housewife, honey." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I calmly reached for his expensive gold pen, looked him dead in the eye, and signed the papers right then and there. I smiled gently and said, "You have no idea what you've just done." Everyone, including his high-priced corporate defense lawyers, thought I had completely lost my mind. They thought they were trapping a defenseless woman. But just 2 weeks later, the courtroom doors shut. The judge opened my financial records, and the court finally revealed my real net worth. My husband's smirking face turned completely pale. "My name is Victoria. I am 42 years old, and for the past 15 years, everyone in our high society circle viewed me as nothing more than a quiet, dutiful housewife. They saw me hosting elegant dinner parties, smiling beside my husband Richard, and curating a flawless home. What they didn't see, and what Richard completely forgot, was that before we married, I was a rising star on a brilliant corporate trajectory. I chose to step back from the public eye to help him build his high-profile real estate firm from the ground up. While Richard acted as the loud, charismatic face of the company, I was the strategic mastermind working late into the night behind the scenes. I structured the complex contracts, analyzed the market trends, and quietly engineered our largest acquisitions. But as the money poured in, Richard's ego ballooned. He began treating me like an uneducated employee rather than an equal partner. He assumed that because the corporate accounts were in his name, the power belonged entirely to him. He genuinely believed his own lie, that I was just a defenseless, dependent woman who couldn't survive without his generosity. He had no idea I was always 10 steps ahead. It started with the subtle shifts that only a wife of 15 years would notice. Richard began taking hushed, urgent phone calls in the middle of the night, hastily locking his phone whenever I walked into the room. His routine changed. Sudden business trips materialized out of nowhere, and the warmth completely vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating detachment. I knew the signs. He wasn't just pulling away emotionally, he was preparing a corporate ambush. When I checked our shared digital records, I discovered that large sums of money were quietly being moved out of our primary joint accounts into unfamiliar corporate entities. He thought he was being incredibly clever, laying the groundwork to blindside me with a sudden divorce and leave me completely penniless before I even realized what was happening. But I am not the type of woman to panic or scream. Instead, I quietly went to work. Before I tell you how I secretly outsmarted his entire high-priced legal team, take a brief moment to follow my journey until the very end and comment the city or country you're watching from today, so I can see exactly how far my voice has reached. While Richard was busy celebrating his perceived cleverness, I secretly retained the services of an elite forensic accountant. I handed over a decade's worth of background data, tax filings, and hidden transaction receipts that I had meticulously backed up over the years. Within days, the audit confirmed my worst suspicions. Richard was actively funneling millions of dollars of our shared marital assets into offshore shell companies, trying to erase my footprint from the very empire I helped him build. He was setting a trap for me, completely unaware that he was actually walking straight into mine. The forensic report was a masterclass in corporate greed. Richard had established 3 distinct shell companies, routing our hard-earned marital funds through complex networks to obscure the trail. He truly believed he had left me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a mountain of engineered corporate debt. What my arrogant husband completely failed to realize, however, was that I had been maintaining a secret financial fortress of my own for over a decade. Long before our marriage dynamic soured, I had inherited a modest sum from my grandmother. Instead of merging it into our joint accounts, I kept it completely separate, quietly investing it into early-stage tech startups and index funds that Richard always dismissed as foolish, high-risk gambles. Over the 15 years of our marriage, while I was busy running his company's operations, those independent investments had quietly ballooned into an absolute powerhouse of a portfolio. I had also quietly structured my personal family inheritance under a protected private trust, completely shielded from any marital property claims. Legally, every single dollar of that massive fortune belonged exclusively to me, and Richard had absolutely no legal right to touch it. I coordinated with my legal team to fortify these assets, leaving all my personal records completely sealed until the absolute perfect moment. Meanwhile, I intentionally left Richard's corporate bait exposed, allowing him to continue his fraudulent transfers. He was so blinded by his own greed and his desire to see me ruined that he never bothered to check if the quiet housewife he was mocking had a safety net of her own. He was sprinting toward a cliff, thinking he was flying. The day of the confrontation arrived exactly as I knew it would. Richard walked into the house with an air of absolute authority, flanked by his aggressive, high-priced corporate defense attorney. They didn't come to negotiate. They came to crush my spirit. Richard threw the paperwork onto the kitchen island, the heavy thud echoing through the quiet house. "Sign it, Victoria," he demanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's over. I'm offering you a standard separation allowance of $50,000 and a small rented apartment in the suburbs for 6 months. If you try to fight me in court, my lawyers will drag this out for years until you're completely broke and sleeping on the streets." His lawyer stood beside him, adjusting his expensive suit jacket with a smug, knowing smile that made my skin crawl. He handed me a gold pen, confidently declaring that this was the most generous offer I would ever receive under the circumstances. Richard openly laughed at my intelligence, mocking the 15 years I had dedicated to his life and company. He genuinely believed that a quiet housewife would collapse under the immense pressure of a corporate legal threat. I didn't flinch. I didn't shed a single tear or utter a word of protest. Instead, I calmly picked up the pen, signed the settlement documents with theatrical precision, and looked him dead in the eye. I let them believe their quick intimidation tactic had worked flawlessly, completely unaware they had just sealed their own fate. The final divorce and asset distribution hearing took place in a packed family courtroom, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving glow of fluorescent lights. Richard sat confidently on the opposite side of the aisle, flanked by his elite legal team. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a look of absolute smugness, occasionally whispering to his lead attorney and gesturing toward me with a dismissive smirk. He fully expected the judge to rubber stamp the heavily biased settlement agreement I had signed at the kitchen table. To him, this hearing was a mere formality, the final victory lap before he could publicly discard me and claim the entire real estate empire for himself. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically when the judge called our case forward. Richard's lawyer stood up with practiced arrogance, presenting the signed agreement and confidently claiming that both parties had reached a mutually agreeable, final settlement. But before the judge could pick up her pen, my own legal counsel calmly stood up. With a clear, resonant voice that echoed through the quiet courtroom, he formally rejected the settlement agreement, citing massive, systemic financial fraud perpetrated by the petitioner. Richard's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. My attorney stepped forward and submitted the comprehensive forensic accounting report, alongside my fully verified comprehensive financial disclosure statement. The judge adjusted her glasses, opened the documentation, and began reading the information silently. The silence in the courtroom stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the sharp rustle of turning pages. As the judge reviewed the hidden offshore transactions, the secret shell companies, and the verified independent asset declarations, her expression grew increasingly stern. She looked up from the bench, her piercing gaze locking directly onto Richard, whose smug composure was suddenly beginning to crack under the pressure. The judge cleared her throat, the sound echoing sharply off the wood-paneled walls. The settlement agreement presented by the petitioner is hereby completely invalidated due to gross financial concealment, she announced firmly. Richard froze, his eyes widening in shock. The judge then began detailing the findings from our forensic report, ordering the immediate freezing and seizure of every single offshore account and hidden shell company Richard had established. Because he had committed fraud trying to hide marital assets, the court ruled that the entirety of his real estate company's remaining value would be awarded to me as compensation. But the true shockwave hit the room when the judge turned to my verified financial disclosure statement to review our respective individual holdings. She officially read aloud my independent net worth, detailing the massive tech portfolio and the protected family trust that I had quietly managed entirely on my own. Hearing the astronomical multi-million-dollar figure announced by the court, Richard's lead attorney turned completely pale, dropping his pen onto the table. Richard gasped openly, staring at me in absolute horror as he realized that the quiet housewife he had mocked was actually vastly wealthier than he had ever been. To make matters worse, due to the immense corporate debts Richard had foolishly accumulated while trying to engineer my downfall, the judge ordered him to personally shoulder those liabilities while paying for all of my elite legal fees. His arrogant smile vanished entirely as he realized his greed had utterly ruined him. 3 months later, I sat on the sun-drenched deck of my beautiful new beachfront home, listening to the gentle crash of the waves. The air was crisp, clean, and completely free of the toxic manipulation that had suffocated me for 15 years. With my independent wealth secured and full ownership of the real estate empire, I rebranded the company, placing brilliant, ethical professionals at the helm while I focused on new, empowering ventures. I received word that Richard had filed for personal bankruptcy, forced to sell his luxury cars just to cover a fraction of the debts he engineered. He was now living in a tiny, cramped apartment, completely ruined by his own arrogance. If you were in my shoes, would you have hidden your success until that final courtroom day, or would you have confronted him sooner? Let me know your thoughts down below. I'm leaving 2 other incredible, unexpected stories on the screen right now that I know you will absolutely love. Thank you for listening.